Great. Okay, so today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the PS function, as it's called. So the post-market surveillance and market surveillance aspect of the medical devices global benchmarking tool. For those of you that might be quite familiar with the medicines GBT tool, you'll remember that there is two functions, one called vigilance and one called market surveillance and control, VL and MC respectively. For medical devices, we decided to bring those two functions together under one function, which we're going to call PS, which is post-market surveillance and market surveillance. There are many reasons that we did this, and I hope that it will become apparent in this first presentation that I'll make some of the reasons why we took this approach and why we think there are some specificities for medical devices, which means that applying a medicines model might not be the most resource, well, to make it more cost effective in a way with the minimal resources. So I'm just going to start with two definitions. And again, this is because a lot of the time we work with regulatory authorities that are now just adding medical devices to their function, their legal functions, and trying to expand what they are doing. And people often think of post-market surveillance as they do in the medicine side, which is the going and sampling of products from the supply chain, either before they are distributed or after even, and tested. Whereas for medical devices, it's rather different because it's actually rather difficult to sample and test products. And in fact, the number of medical devices is just so much greater than there is of medicine. So if we were to be adopting this idea of an authority going and sampling products, testing them to see if they are still within specification, we would need hundreds of thousands of people in our regulatory authorities. So we adopt a different approach, which is to delegate a lot of the responsibility to the manufacturer to ensure that the products are safe, well-performing, and are of good quality. So for medical devices, the definition of post-market surveillance is the systematic process that's carried out by the legal manufacturer to collect and analyze experience gained with medical devices that have been placed on the market by them. So that's a bit different than a regulator reviewing evidence and data about the use of a product. This is about manufacturers. And obviously, a manufacturer cannot be in all places at the one time, and they may also rely on their local authorized representatives. But at the heart of it is that a manufacturer will know exactly where they've sent their product, which lot numbers or serial numbers or models they have sent and distributed. They will also know where there have been reports of problems with their devices. And we talk here a lot about experience. I don't use the word complaints. We've decided to move away from using that word, although it is used in many of the ISO documents. We feel that collecting experiences means that you can get the good experiences, the bad experiences, and then you can actually start to filter through all that information. And some of it will be important for regulators to know, but other parts of it will be important for the manufacturer to know, to look at whether or not they can improve the design of their device to make it more usable. And I think that's where with medicines and devices it's a bit different. For medicines, it's really taking a pill, can you swallow it, these sort of things. Whereas for devices, they are used. There's a human factors element. And sometimes, or many times actually, with incidents that are reported, there may be a root cause that is the use of the device, a use error. But obviously that can be redesigned and designed out to ensure that it doesn't continue to present risk. So for our all intensive purposes, post-market surveillance for us is something the manufacturers do, and you need to have legal provisions that oblige manufacturers to do post-market surveillance and then enforce that. Whereas you as a regulator would conduct a market surveillance function, where you might make certain checks and balances to ensure that devices continue to comply or continue to be within the specifications that they were when they were placed on the market. And that might mean a whole range of things. It may mean, and we'll get into that, but a lot of it is around analysis of data. And so data is incredibly important for this post-market monitoring. And you'll notice in this presentation that I have a purple box on many of the slides, and this is the respective sub-indicator that the WHO guidance document relates to in the WHO Global Benchmarking Tool. And so this very important aspect of legal provisions for market surveillance and control, it must establish how the regulator would deal with unsafe medical devices and substandard or falsified. And I think that's another point of difference with medicines, where we think safety and we think vigilance and we perhaps think quality and substandard or falsified. For medical devices, it's sort of one and the same. You have a problem with the device, it may function, it may deteriorate, there may be an effect on the patient, and then you start to investigate, and it may be that quality was the cause, but at the root, it often starts as a safety issue. So I'm going to talk through a little bit what we mean when we say manufacturers should conduct post-market surveillance, that they should be collecting information about their product. Here, as I just mentioned in purple, you should have legal provisions and you should have regulations that require manufacturers to have a system for post-market surveillance. You may want to go a bit further and ensure that you have some legal provisions for local authorized representatives. I know in some countries, you find it hard to have a legal provision for a party that's located in another country, but you do need to have some link back to the legal manufacturer. It can't only be at the level of the local authorized representative. And you'll see in a minute why that's the case. So the first is making sure that you have a way to collect all of the user feedback. And when I say user, I'm meaning healthcare professionals, hospitals, testing, medical laboratories, but also communities and patient citizens themselves, particularly with self-testing and other kinds of medical devices where somebody might go as a consumer and purchase them. These are perhaps more the lower risk devices, but certainly HIV self-test, syphilis self-test, COVID self-test, hepatitis C self-test. These are all the kinds of devices that are used outside of a health facility. So you've got users in health facilities and users outside health facilities. So as a manufacturer, you need to have a way in which you can collect all of that information. And that's basically by making sure you have the details for how to contact you on the label of the device. Then when all of that feedback comes in, manufacturers need to have a way to sort through that and triage and determine what of the feedback would meet the definition of an incident and would be reportable, and so determine if it needs to be reported to a regulator in one or more jurisdictions. It's then the responsibility of the manufacturer to conduct the root cause analysis. And I know that this can be a bit difficult for some people who are not in the regulatory space to get their head around, but the manufacturer is best placed to conduct the root cause analysis. And you as regulators are best placed to oversee that and to check that what they're doing is scientific, is following documented procedures, and is timely, that they're quickly moving to make sure that the risks to the patients can be mitigated if they need to be. This is because the manufacturer knows exactly how they constructed and manufactured that device. They know where all of the different lots might have gone, or where similar product that had the same or similar components. I mean, I'll talk a lot about rapid tests because that's my speciality, but I'm thinking about nitrocellulose, I'm thinking about buffers, I'm thinking about lancets. These are often components that are used in many products in one manufacturing facility. Nitrocellulose is notorious for being a difficult raw component. And so if you have a problem with one product, let's say it's your malaria rapid test, It may be that that same lot of nitrocellulose was used in your HIV rapid test, your hepatitis C. And so looking at production records for everything that used that raw component is very important to be able to rule in or rule out manufacturing deficiency. It's also at the level of the manufacturer to determine if a correction should be made, because they can understand, again, who else got that product, and what is the scope of the correction. So at the national level, you will understand as a regulator what's happening in your country, in your jurisdiction, but you may not know what's happening in other parts of the world. And it's not just necessarily your region. Medical devices go all over the world. They're used in all sorts of settings. And so it's often very hard to actually minimize the risk unless the manufacturer is obliged to do that legally. And that's where the legal provisions and regulations requiring manufacturers having a post-market surveillance system is a really foundational element that we recommend. And I've got here on the right side of this slide just a few definitions. People say, what's user feedback? Well, it's what you probably used to call a complaint, but it's also other forms of information that a manufacturer might get through training, installation, maintenance visits, surveys, and a lot through their sales and marketing. So for instance, if they were selling their product to a customer, things were going fine, and then all of a sudden they were not getting orders, I would go and ask why and try to find out if it's something about the product, if there was an experience with the product that they had not been made aware of otherwise. So being proactive to try to find out information as well as waiting for perhaps those complaints to come in. Then when we talk about correction, we're not talking about recalls very often, as often as we might do for medicines. We have modifications that can be done to instruments where mainly software updates, maybe labeling updates, maybe the instructions might be made clearer. And then on the corrective and preventive action, that's often more at the level of the production facility. And it's about maybe making changes to the design of the product or the manufacturing processes of the product. It may be around their quality control when they release product. It may be about their incoming goods quality control. There's a lot that can be done to improve the performance of products. So I mentioned then about all of that user feedback that might come to a manufacturer, but then it's really important that regulators are made aware of certain higher risk incidents, because let me tell you, as a regulator, you do not want to have every single piece of feedback about a medical device. You need to be able to manage your resources, and you need to be able to focus on the events or the incidents that will have a significant, will have some impact on public health and individual health. So when we set up this part of our WHO guidelines, we looked at what other regulators were issuing as timelines, and what we found was it varied quite a bit. And so we tried to find a middle ground, which we thought was not more strict or less strict than what was currently in place. So we have here that if it's a serious public health threat, that should be reported within 48 hours. So the manufacturer would report to the regulator no later than 48 hours. And we have here at the bottom a definition of a serious public health threat. It's really around imminent risk of death for one or more people. So if it's just one person, that's a little bit different to more than one. And also it relates to if you took an action, you would prevent that death. So it's imminent risk, more than one, and requires prompt remedial action. If the incident doesn't fit that definition, and I can tell you in the 12 years I've been receiving incidents, I've never had one of those. More often what I have is where an incident related in death or serious deterioration in health of the patient or the user or another person. And what we say is for those kind of incidents, they should be reported no later than 10 calendar days of the manufacturer becoming aware. And I'll give here a little bit, because I'm an IVD person, a medical lab scientist, I'll tell you, for IVDs, people sometimes find this hard to understand or to compute because you very rarely have a death associated with a medical device, an IVD, sorry. It's more likely an indirect harm, such as a false negative. So for me, a false negative or a false positive where it leads to misdiagnosis, that must be reported. And so we have one last category, which is when death or serious deterioration might have happened. And those are the kind of incidents that should come within 30 days. So I think here you can see these three sort of timelines relates quite a bit to risk. These are sometimes called a near miss. And these are a pretty, also a fairly large category. These timelines align fairly well with the European timelines in the EU. For the US FDA, they have a 30-day report for everything. So we're probably a bit, I wouldn't say stricter. Our timelines are a bit shorter than the US FDA, but are the same as the European Union. And for the most part, most countries align themselves behind the EU. So I think it's important to realize that this is part of, for the GBT, it relates to one of the sub-indicators around guidelines for reporting. You as a regulator need to set in place, what are these timelines for manufacturers to report to you? And I suggest you base it as, have as harmonized as possible. So maybe following the WHO recommendations here, or looking at, because obviously if the manufacturers have different reporting timelines in each different country, it's going to be very hard for them to comply. And obviously this is something you should enforce. If they don't report within a certain time, you can issue a penalty. And that would normally be a fine. So we know that there's a lot of data that comes in, and then when it gets to reported to you as regulators, trying to make sense of this data is important because yes, you're looking incident by incident, but then you've also got to start to look at your metadata, looking at for trends. And in order to try to find trends and signals, which happens as you start to gather more and more incidents and you start to be able to go from more reacting to a more proactive maturity in your authority. So that's as we're going from ML1 to up to 3, 4, you'll need to turn into being able to analyze big data. So I recommend when you're starting out with receiving incidents or you're trying to build up your current system, establishing coding and terminology is really helpful, even though most people would say, oh, that's an advanced kind of regulatory activity. I actually think it's really great at the basic level, and I've used it for the WHO database and I find it enormously useful. So we follow the International Medical Device Regulators Forum guidance on this topic. They call it adverse event terminology, but really it's more than adverse events. It includes incidents. And I know that in some jurisdictions, maybe you use the word adverse event, in others you might use incident. Sometimes they're interchangeable. Sometimes an incident is more than just an adverse event. Particularly was an adverse event is really, when something happens to a person, whereas an incident is something happened to a device. And so I personally feel I'd like to know what happens to a device and the person, not just the person, because if I understand what's happened at the level of the device, I might be able to catch something before it's used on a person. So we as WHO official observers to the IMDRF, and I sit in this working group that has developed this terminology. It's actually based on the US FDA's codes. US FDA was very generous in providing all of their coding, all of their terms and all their definitions. And then we as a working group have worked through every single line to align ourselves as IMDRF regulators. So you will see all of this coming into force across the IMDRF. So if you're an IMDRF affiliate member, you should already start to know about this and you should start to make this part of your market surveillance function. You can see here in purple, there are 2 sub-indicators related to this around procedures and tools for the receipt of manufacturer investigation, incident reports, and also the receipt of field safety corrective action reports, which is, the so-called recall, that when you need to do something. And so the first elements that are really important is what is the actual problem and what is the impact? As I've sort of mentioned a little bit, like understanding what happens at the level of the patient's important, but very often I get an F26, no health consequences or impact, but there is nevertheless something that's occurred at the level of the device that could have led, so that's that 30-day report, it could have led to a misdiagnosis. And often then I do get straight misdiagnoses. But then these problems, and you can understand that when you start to be looking for what's the rate of false positives or the rate of false negatives, you then also need to look at what's the rate of misdiagnosis. And just because you get a false positive or a false negative does not necessarily mean you get a misdiagnosis. And certainly there are lots of codes around, and for those who are interested, we can do a big deep dive on that another time. So the other part of incidents being reported to you by the manufacturer is that they must report their investigation. How did they determine if their device is the root cause and what exactly about their device? And a lot of the time, what manufacturers are doing is actually trying to rule out a manufacturing deficiency or ruling out that that was something that was within their control. And this concept of ruling in and ruling out is really important because it's often very hard to objectively show a link of causality. And that's something that I know that in the medicines world and vaccines world is a similar important topic. But I recommend already starting to start coding the types of investigations that are done, the investigation findings, and the conclusion. This helps. I use this actually to make my own work instructions. So when I'm reviewing an investigation report, there are a minimum set of investigations I'm expecting. I'm expecting that if it's an IVD or another kind of high volume consumable or the single-use device, that they have retained samples of that lot and they would be examining those or testing those. I'm expecting that they're doing a trend analysis of other feedback about that product, about that lot number, about that product code or model number. I'm expecting that they might look at production records. They might seek information from third parties, such as a third-party tester or a third-party maintenance organization. Then when it comes to the actual findings, this is really important. This is trying to understand what is the root cause and then what might we do about it. So if it is, for example, a software installation problem, that could be the finding, but the solution, but the conclusion might be, well, we didn't design the software well, or we didn't validate the software properly. So, one part of it is, well, we need to, validate the software or reinstall the software. And then maybe we need to change part of our procedures in how we actually selected our software vendor. And you can see here at the bottom that there is a possibility of falsified medical devices. I think as we start to get better at enforcing post-market surveillance, we're going to start seeing or have the ability to detect falsified medical devices. And they often might come in as a false negative. And then you go and look and see, actually, this is a expiry date that has been changed. So that would be something like a labeling issue. But the conclusion is falsified device. So I find this to be a very useful way to help me consistently review incidents to make sure there was methods, findings, and a conclusion. The other important part is, yes, I've talked a lot about user feedback, and then I've talked about incidents, and then there are some incidents that will lead to a field safety corrective action. There will need to be something done at the level of the user to reduce the risk to the patient, to the user themselves, or somebody else. And here are the different types of field safety corrective actions. I've always adopted this term. I think in the US, they might still use the word recalls, but most of the IMDRF countries are already using the word field safety corrective action. These include returning the device, so more commonly a recall, device modification, device exchange, if it's a very big instrument and they provide a loaner or a backup instrument, maybe device destruction, which might also be in some cases defined as a recall, or advice about how to use the device. And that is between modification and advice, these are the two most common that I have. And I just wanted to see here in blue, you can see when we say device modification, what we really mean. And I want to draw your attention to the second and third. A change to the instructions for use. It's very common. I'm just dealing with one today, and it affects millions and millions and millions of tests, and they're making a particular change to the instructions for use. So they're not going to recall the product. They're not going to have it returned. They're just going to issue an instructions for use change. And software upgrades. Very, 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 very common. Anything that has software in it or has some sort of electrical component, software upgrades are very, very common as a way to manage a problem with a product. Say there's more false negatives or invalid results or what have you. And so, as I said here, having procedures for being able to know how to review these field safety corrective actions and understand, are they appropriate? Do they actually redress? So you have a risk and a benefit, and you will do a field safety corrective action when the risks start to outweigh the benefits. And you want a field safety corrective action to bring that back the other way, and the benefits outweigh the risks. So being able to assess those is really important. And at this point, you may have the authorized representative of the manufacturer supporting the field safety corrective action. For example, they may go out on site and ensure the software update has been made and you've revalidated the device before you use it on patients. We do have an ISO standard that also provides very similar information to what's in the WHO guidance. They were actually produced around about the same time, completely independently of each other. But it does happen that the authors of the ISO standard are also were authors who supported me in the development of the post-market surveillance guide. So it's very much aligned. But one of the main important aspects of the ISO standard is the idea of a post-market surveillance plan. And I think it's something that is very useful and possibly something that you should also enshrine in your, perhaps maybe not, your regulations, perhaps not so much in your legal provisions, but this is being more proactive. And this is something that really is very recent. And this is, I think, only from 2020. And it sort of is because there had been lots of changes, particularly in the European Union, around the regulation of medical devices. And it's about being more proactive, not just looking at user feedback, but looking at production records, looking at scientific literature, and conducting post-market performance follow-up or post-market clinical follow-up, depending if it's a device or an IVD. I'm going to talk here just a little bit about the roles of other entities. So agents, wholesalers, distributors, marketing authorization holders. In Australia, they call them sponsors, somebody other than the legal manufacturer. And I think this is a really tricky part of this regulatory function, is knowing who do you work with as a regulator? Who do you enforce the legal provisions on? Who must follow your regulations? And it can be delegated to a local business entity in your country, but there must be a very strong supplier agreement between that local entity and the legal manufacturer. And that's perhaps something you might even want to have as part of your marketing authorization, is understanding how that agreement is, or the quality of that agreement, to be very honest with you. Because if the local representative is receiving information about the product, they must forward it on to the legal manufacturer. And as you can imagine, a local authorized representative has commercial interests. It may not always be in their best interest to forward that information on. So you must legally oblige them to. Very often it might be that they are translating the instructions into language that's more appropriate for their setting. But that means that if there is a change made to a product at the legal manufacturers, that also needs to be translated down or transferred down to be translated. So really making sure that those supplier agreements are very descriptive, precise, and very tight. Because in the end, who is it that decides if the product is unsafe? An authorized local representative, they can help it to be removed from their market, but that means that other markets are still at risk. So the legal manufacturer is the one that can remove the product and remove unsafe product from all markets globally. And so I think that's something really important to consider when you're navigating this. And we certainly here have in the market surveillance function a sub-indicator around guidelines for people to be, other than the manufacturer, to be reporting information to the NRA. So people often say, okay, well, it sounds like the manufacturer is doing everything. What's the role for me as a regulator? What do I do? Well, it might be that you receive user feedback from your citizens. it's entirely normal that they would say, oh, I'm going to report this to the regulator rather than reporting it to the manufacturer. And you're more than welcome to do that. However, there will be a limit to how much you can actually determine if the product is safe or unsafe. And so I recommend that you forward that user feedback along straight away. You might decide that you want to review if this product actually has market authorization and if this local representative has authorization to import. Because if they don't, and it's an unregistered product, you can already take action. But if it's something that is authorized to be used in your country and the economic operator is licensed, then it's within your jurisdiction. You can forward the feedback to the manufacturer and say, I want that first investigation report within 15 days. I think 15 days is WHO rule of thumb, and I would suggest it might be for yourselves as well. And then it becomes that your role, your primary role, is really on reviewing their investigation report. That's basically what I do day in, day out. I'm reviewing their report for, as I said, scientific accuracy, timeliness, and that they're following documented procedures. They're not just sort of deciding, oh, this must be the root cause, oh, it's the user, and not actually showing objective evidence that can demonstrate if the user did this, that would lead to a false negative or invalid or whatever it might be. You will also need to review their field safety corrective actions. As I said, this is when an incident goes from, oh, this is an incident at the level of one patient to we need to do something. We need to instruct users to do something. There is an element of testing that you might oversee. We do not really talk a lot about testing in the global benchmarking tool for many reasons. We certainly don't recommend pre-shipment testing. I know that it has happened in the past, but we have been unable to see the cost-benefit advantage. So testing costs a lot of money. You have to have a lab that it's accredited or is performing well. They need to know the techniques, and it needs to be that you have a sufficient statistical validity. So the way that you sample products and how much of them you sample to be able to conclusively say, based on this testing, this product is still within specification or not. So I won't spoke a lot about testing in this presentation today. The other role is obviously determining if additional regulatory action needs to be taken. Sometimes manufacturers just will not do the necessary. They will take 6 months. They will not find the root cause. They will not even reply to you. This is the time when you take regulatory action, and that might be that you issue your own notice. Something like a safety alert or any other, in WHO we call them information notices for users. It's when you've given the manufacturer a reasonable amount of time to conduct their investigation, determine if there needs to be a correction, and they may not have done that. You might also want to share this information with other regulators, and the easiest way to do that is by having a public repository of field safety notices. So any field safety corrective action is notified through a one-page document, preferably one page, called a field safety notice. And I think that that's something that I would really like to have all regulators here today working on a repository of field safety notices that actually is searchable and is not just PDFs put on a website, might I say. It's very hard to be able to collect information. And me at a global level looking to see, what field safety notices are out there. It's anyway, we can talk about that in some depth. As I mentioned, or I've already actually talked about this, is that users might report directly to you as regulators. The thing is that they have to know you exist. They have to know how to contact you. And as I said, for a medical device, on the label, they'll have the legal manufacturer's name, and they should also have an email address and preferably a phone number that can be text or called. And I do not know of any medical devices where they will put the number of a regulator on there or an email address. It's very rare that the authorized representative is there. I know it is in Europe, but I do not know of many other jurisdictions that will put the wholesaler or distributor on the label. So although it will happen, and you may, as a public institution, want to have a way for the public to report to you, but it's really important to forward that information on to the manufacturers to conduct the investigation. So another role, once you've got through all of those incident reports, field safety corrective actions, publishing field safety notices, you're kind of reacting. You're reacting to information coming to you. Once you grow in your maturity, you'll start to be a bit more proactive, where you'll be out there looking for trends. And these are the kinds of analysis that you might want to start to be able to do, is looking at the frequency of a particular problem. So false negatives or malfunctioning hip implants. You might want to look at how the severity of the impact on the patient. And this is classic risk management, isn't it? Like, how frequently is something happening and what is the severity of the impact? And so you might want to, for instance, always be looking at the rate of death, the rate of serious deterioration in health, rate of misdiagnosis, for example. Looking for specific patterns, so patterns across specific devices, specific lots, specific manufacturers, because sometimes there might be a design issue related to a particular device. It might just be a lot issue where just that lot or those serial numbers was just not good for some reason. That often comes when you have big orders and you need to all of a sudden turn around a large order. You bring on extra staff, maybe they're not as well versed in quality management, or they're rushing and rushing and rushing. They don't do quality control properly. So you see an impact with certain lots, but not all. But sometimes you see it at the level of manufacturing, of a manufacturer. It means all products that they make have an issue. And that's a fundamental quality management issue. You then also want to use your data analysis to look at enforcement. It's very hard often to enforce post-market surveillance, but having timelines and requirements is a very easy way to show compliance, and also a good way to generate penalties. And also, like, you may wish to look at the way in which you use your time, and maybe more specifically look at monitor introduction of new technologies. So, for instance, computer-aided detection of tuberculosis using AI. You may want to focus on AI-enabled medical devices. I mentioned a bit there about field safety notices. It's just the biggest, well, biggest is not the right word. I feel it's like one of the most impactful things you can do as a network, as the PAHO regional network, is posting your field safety notices, making them available to others. The IMDRF has a part of their website that has a lot of the email addresses or the websites where you can find these databases. Personally, what I do is I sign up to the email alerts. So, for instance, in the UK, I get an email once a week. Ireland, which is in the European Union, I get it once a month. The United States FDA, I get it every time they put something on the safety part of their website. Health Canada and Australia, the same. And so I start to be getting this information coming to me proactively, and I'm able to check to see if those field safety notices would be anything WHO would be interested in. And when I say what we'd be interested in, it's mainly pre-qualified products, emergency use listed products, or other products that are approved or procured by WHO. And actually, for those that category of pre-qualified products, those manufacturers are obliged to report to WHO and the Global Surveillance and Monitoring System. So for those of you that don't know this, this is a system which we've had in place for about 12 years. Primarily developed for medicines and vaccines, but for the last 7 years, it's also had all of the data related to IVDs. As you can see here, we actually use the IMDRF coding, and this is a way in which we can review post-market surveillance that manufacturers are doing in low and middle income settings, so in countries where there may not be legal provisions just yet. This is my second to last slide here. So all of the presentation I've just given is available actually in Spanish language in our normative guidance. I've put here the Spanish version. We first issued this guidance in 2015, and this is an update we made in 2020. And we're hoping to make an update in the next year or two of this. So what you could kind of consider is that you have the global benchmarking tool that helps you to understand all your different regulatory functions and it looks at legal provisions, regulations, and guidelines, and then procedures. And you might look at this guidance at that sort of guideline level of helping you to put together your guidelines. It doesn't have a lot in there about legal provisions and regulations. So it's sort of more that third tier. But it really does reflect the relevant ISO guidance. So ISO 13485, which has a big clause around customer feedback. So that's why we use the word feedback. That's how ISO talks about it. Also the ISO standard on post-market surveillance, and we really heavily refer to IMDRF guidance on this topic. So
floor is yours.
Yeah, okay. So I'm going to bring up my other presentation, which is very text heavy. And I feel like I've already kind of presented some of the highlights already. Just want to double check you can see my screen.
Yes, we can.
Great. So this is the fact sheets. Andrea already kind of ran you through a few of the fact sheets the other day. And what I have just done is tried to just present them in a slide, even though it is really best to then go and look at the global benchmarking tool itself. So if you've got it installed on your computer, that's great. If you've had a lot of trouble, you can still download the manual. It's about 400 pages, but to be honest, I actually use that quite a lot. I'm just going to walk you through the 6 indicators that we have in the post-market surveillance, market surveillance control function. As I said, this is the combination of the vigilance function and the market surveillance function. We've put them together. So we have 6 indicators, and then under that we have sub-indicators, and I'll get into that in a minute. So I think it follows very much the same as what you heard already, and you will hear tomorrow. The first indicator is always around legal provisions, regulations, and guidelines. And that's where we've talked about the guidance just then. So that will help you with that third level. And then regulations, legal provisions being really fundamental. If you don't have legal provisions, you'll never be able to progress above and maturity level 1. It's fundamental to everything you do, and then building on. So if you have guidelines but not regulations, yeah, you'll be ML1. Looking at the way that you effectively organize the authority is important. Do you have the dedicated human resources to perform? Oh, I should have this in presentation mode, sorry. Do you have the necessary human resources? And then I talked a lot about legal provisions, regulations, and guidelines, but indicator 4 is always around procedures. Do you have procedures in place that enable the human resources in the authority to be able to review post-market surveillance activities and conduct market surveillance and control? And then the last 2 are really around monitoring your regulatory performance. And that's where I talked a lot about timelines, 48 hours, 10 days, 30 days. Then I talked about 15 days to review to ask manufacturers to provide report to you. Then I set myself 15 days to review. And then I'm able to see, have I got enough staff to be able to keep to those timelines? And then mechanisms to promote communication with each other and transparency. And that's why I talked a lot about the field safety notices database. If you've got one of those, that really goes a long way to you being able to fulfill the requirements for that indicator. So I'm going to dig into the first indicator, which is around legal provisions in some details here. You have to be established as dealing with unsafe and substandard falsified medical products. That's where often safety can sometimes people think, oh, maybe it's with the hospitals, or maybe it's with, no, you as the regulator need to be able to be the one that says this is safe or this is not safe, and you do that along with the manufacturer. Second sub-indicator is you must require that manufacturers have post-market surveillance, that they have a system. And you might want to, in your guidelines and procedures, elaborate what you mean by a system. User feedback, incident reporting, field safety corrective actions. Like I kind of already gave you a few of the tips of what post-market surveillance should practically look like. You want to be able to engage healthcare professionals. So this is 0103. Healthcare professionals use devices day in, day out. They are the first to know when there's a problem. They must be encouraged to report their feedback. I personally don't think you can mandate a healthcare professional to report. Why? Because you are not regulating the healthcare professional. You're regulating the product and the manufacturer. You don't regulate healthcare professionals. So if a healthcare professional does not report, you cannot actually enforce that. You cannot. And also, I would say that's a lot to put on a person. It should be at the level of the institution that employs healthcare professionals, that there is recognized that there's encouraged to report feedback. I think the only place where that might be different is the United States. But as you can imagine, that does lead into legal and litigation aspects. If a healthcare professional is legally required to report an incident and they don't, that leads, you can see where that can lead. I don't know if we want to get into that. We want to promote a culture of transparency and continual improvement. I'm going to have to start to move through these very quickly, but you will have access to this presentation, and really all of this information is in the GBT tool itself. You'll be able to go and look at the evidence to review that helps you to interpret what I mean when I say guidelines for monitoring and reporting of adverse events and incidents and field safety corrective actions. We also talk here about having in 0107 about importation. And a lot of you mentioned that you're importing country, you're importing devices. But here, looking at what are the legal provisions that may allow or deny products to come in. And you'll need to think about donations. You will have donated medical devices. So what happens with respect to importation when you have donations? And this is really about having designated or permanent regulatory intervention at your ports of entry. It's a very similar concept that you have for medicines. We also talk here a little bit about promotion of promotion marketing, but also here at 0110, legal provisions exist for establishing a unique device identifying system. We had a question on that. So there's a legal provision here that you might want to put in place. And then some more on guidelines around what importers must do to have the necessary authorization. And then importantly, what to do when you have field safety corrective actions and there may need to be a decommissioning and disposal of a medical device. It's not the same as a medicine where you can just crush it, destroy it, burn it, bury it, whatever you need to do. You cannot do that to a large X-ray machine. So understanding how you will make the manufacturer or local authorized representative responsible for that. In terms of the second indicator around effective organization, it's really about making sure that in your organogram, you know who's going to do what. In a lot of countries, I see we have medicines and we have, market authorization, inspection, vigilance, or what have you. And then they might just add it to the responsibility, add medical devices. And so whether or not you might have a separate medical devices division or a separate post-market surveillance that includes everything, there just needs to be a defined structure. That's helpful for this next indicator, which is around human resources. Do you have sufficient competent staff that can conduct these activities and oversee the activities of manufacturers? Are the duties and responsibilities clearly established in a job description? Do you have a training plan? You're always going to have new tech when you work in medical devices. You'll have AI, you'll have wearables, you'll have combination products. You need to be continually being trained on those kinds of new devices. I know we're nearly at time. If I can just quickly get to this PSO4, this is all the procedures. Let me tell you, there's a lot for medical devices post-market surveillance, but we've deliberately split, there's deliberately a lot so that it's just really specific. Procedures are in place to receive and review investigation reports. Procedures are in place to receive and review field safety corrective action reports, signal detection, and so on and so forth. So you can really see that we try to help you to lay out all the different procedures that you'll need. And some of these are ML1, so the lowest maturity level. Some of them, like the signal detection 0403, are for a maturity level 4. So we don't expect to have all of this at the start, but at least to look at what are the maturity level 1 and start to be working towards those. Having safety committees or expert committees. As I said, I'm not an expert in all of these devices. I couldn't possibly be. I need to rely on expert committees being able to convene very quickly to help us adjudicate on emerging safety concerns. There's actually 17 sub-indicators in this procedures one. So I won't go through all of them, but it's really, as you can see, it's quite exhaustive. And it might be that some of these sub-indicators, one document might be able to fulfill a few of the sub-indicators. But in order to make sure that you've got all of the content, we've separated them out. Then for, sorry, Alfonso, I'm second to last couple of slides. This is again,
okay.
Yeah, it's okay. Go a few minutes over. It's really talking about how you monitor your performance. We're always understaffed. Let me tell you, starting to monitor your timelines to being able to make decisions, having databases, it's really important to help you make the case when you need additional staff, or maybe you need just subject matter experts to help fill some of the gaps. And that's what level PSO5 is all about. And then the last, PSO6, is really about how you work together as a network of regulators. How do you communicate information within your authority with your inspectors? I work a lot with inspectors. Why? Because I see a problem and I say to the inspectors, next time you're there, can you look to see, was it fully implemented as they said it was? They wrote it in this report, they signed it, they said they're going to do it. Unless you go there, maybe sometimes you can't always double check. And then that there being a mechanism to share with relevant regional and international. That's 0604. Really important. And I really think starting with sharing field safety notices, that is when we know an action needs to be taken. You need to change the way you use the device or not use the device. Sharing at the incident level is a lot of work and sometimes has limited value. But it's something that we could definitely consider to think about in the years to come. We do not have a VIGI base for medical devices. We have the Global Surveillance and Monitoring System. At the moment, I only receive in the hundreds of reports a year. I know the US FDA receives 200,000 incident reports a year. I know in Australia, where I'm from, 20,000 a year. It's a much smaller population. So if we're starting to share 200,000 incidents across the Americas, I'm just starting to think we start to get, so maybe just starting with field safety notices. And I will leave it there. That's a very quick flyover the fact sheets.